So I'm gonna ask Doug, and mind you, if we have some glitches, we will handle them, and like we handle things in real life when there are technological glitches. So I'm gonna ask Doug to just go ahead and take it away.
Well, thank you. Everybody can hear me all right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, this is a picture of my mother's iris garden from about 1995, I guess. So, and this is where it started for me, my iris obsession. When she introduced me to irises and gave me, I think the first time she gave me 10 irises and I managed to kill them all. So she was generous enough to do it again. But anyway, I wanted to kind of give you a little bit of history of irises and then some practical advice about how to grow irises. So I hope that's something that you we're looking forward to.
Can I pause just a minute and ask Heather, are we recording? Because I want to have this recorded.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Doug.
So the genus Iris dates back in 1753 when Carl Linnaeus, the Swedish botanist, was doing his naming of different plants and so forth, and giving them the names. And it's interesting, if you look at that whole genre of flowering plants, that within this same group is gladiolas, crocus, and freesia, and then of course iris. And today there's probably 260 to 300 different iris species rather, and every year there are thousands of cultivars that are produced. My original presentation that I was going to give to the Grow the Good Life includes about another 45 minutes that was also talked about other kinds of iris. But all I'm going to talk about today are bearded irises. And so I hope that you'll be able to get something from this. The history of irises go back to earliest record that we can find is in 15th century BC. The Pharaoh Thutmose III was a great military leader, and he did a lot of conquering of the Mediterranean. And when he conquered Syria, he discovered that there were the fields were covered with irises. And that Iris damascena down in the lower left-hand corner of this slide is one of those irises that he brought back to Egypt, because in addition to being a great warrior, he was also a great gardener. And so he was excited about this and brought them and then immortalized them in the temple at Karnak in some of the architecture there. If you go forward 7th century BC, we probably are all familiar with the goddess Iris, who transported information or messages from Zeus on Mount Olympus down to man. And how did she get down to Earth to give the messages? Was down a rainbow, right? So the colors of the rainbow are kind of what we associate with the iris. So that's where the link is there. And she had these golden wings that she would fly down. If we move forward to the 5th century AD in France, Clovis I was a Frankish king who was the first to unite all the Frank tribes into one nation, and that's where we get France today. And he, on the day of his conversion to Christianity, he adopted the fleur-de-lis as his symbol. And you know, for the French, this symbol, the three petals stand for faith, wisdom, and valor. And then if we go, then we move forward to the 17th century. We now know that early English settlers coming to Virginia brought irises with them. And they were called Iris germanica is the species they brought with them. They're often still called blue flags. You'll see that they grow, a lot of them grow across the, naturally now across most of the mid-Atlantic area. By the 19th century, they had discovered that if you took the rhizome, the root of the iris, and dried it out and ground it up, it became a great component of perfume making. And so orris root is a real big component of perfumes in the 19th century. And by this time, Italy was kind of in the forefront of that, and they were harvesting over 10,000 tons of iris root each year and exporting it around the world, including to the United States. Then in we get up to the 20th century here, and we started getting hybridizers doing a little bit more study of the genus Iris, and one of the leading students of Iris was a British man named William Dykes, and he wrote the definitive book or study on Iris. And as a result, the American Iris Society formed an award each year to the best iris each year, and they name it the Dykes Medal winner. So that's where that comes from. And just to give you an example, because everybody likes to see some of the pictures, these are some of the winning Dykes Medal winners that go back all the way to the first one in 1927, and then more recently down in the lower right-hand corner, Montmartre. But you can see that the progression of hybridizing and so forth to come up with some pretty amazing flowers, and just shows you the capacity for combining different kinds of color together in hybridizing. Everything from white in like the Song of Norway to almost pure black in the Hello Darkness over in the lower left-hand corner. I have all of these, by the way, in my garden, and right now sort of have had some luck in all of them blooming.
Doug, they're beautiful. When you say hybridizing, can you go a little further on that, or are you?
I will. Yeah, it's part of the presentation.
Okay.
But I wanted to go backward a little bit here and also show you some of the historic, oops, sorry, wrong way. Historic irises that go back, anything before 1989 now is considered a historic iris. And so Mademoiselle Chiraud, 1844, that's when it was hybridized. Fabian, 1868. And you can see that in the early iris hybridizing, they were very plain, no ruffles, very long falls. And I'll talk about the different parts of the iris here just so that this makes some sense. But I wanted to give you some view of what some of these early iris hybridizations looked like.
There's a question, Doug, who gets to name each iris? Do you know that?
Yes, the person who hybridized it comes up with a name and registers it with the American Iris Society. And there's a process that, their name that they want may have already been chosen. So they have to be very careful about picking a name for their iris. I'm going through that very process myself right now, and I'll show you in a little bit about
Cool.
that. So in the bearded iris family, there are various, actually, I guess about 6 different sizes, and that's the way they're measured or defined, is by how high they are. So the lowest one are called the miniature dwarf irises. They're about 8 inches tall. Then the standard dwarf get up to about 16 inches, and then intermediate and so forth. And along the bottom line is sort of the bloom time. And right now we're kind of in the middle of, because the weather has been so strange, and we went straight from fall to summer. We really didn't have much of a winter at all. And then the spring has been really wet. So right now, we're already into the bloom time for the next group of irises, the medium dwarf bearded, the miniature tall bearded, and the tall bearded. So border bearded, tall bearded, and is where we are moving into right now. And I've got some of each of these are blooming as well. So by the end of May, most of the blooms have gone away. But there's been a lot of effort over the last 15, 20 years to develop reblooming irises that will bloom again in October. And so October, November time, you'll see some, and depending upon part of the country you're in, you can get reblooming irises in January. But in the Virginia area here, what I'm seeing is most of my reblooming irises are blooming usually around October or November. So they'll bloom in early spring and then again in fall.
Nice.
So I had this problem yesterday. This slide does not want to.
There's a question while you're working on your slide is when you talk about size in inches, are you talking about the total stalk plus the bloom height?
Yes, how tall the bloom is. Actually, it's measured from how high the bloom is above the ground. That's how they determine what category. And based on some of these, like the border bearded, sometimes because of the weather, it can kind of stunt the growth this year. And so the tall bearded may not grow as high as it could. Right now, I have a couple of tall bearded irises that are blooming, and they are close to 4 feet tall. I mean, it's just amazing how tall the bloom stalk comes above the ground. And that's where when you measure from the top of the flower down to the ground, that's how they get that measurement. Well, this guy just does not want to come up. But what I wanted to do is describe, earlier we talked about the different parts of the iris and how they are identified. Is the part of the iris that comes up like this is called the standard. The part of the iris that goes down is called the fall. Then there's a furry part of the flower that comes out of the center, and that's the beard. And that's predominantly the way the color of the iris is determined. The standards being one color, the falls may be a different color, and the beard may be a completely different color from all of that. But if you look in the center of this image here, you see the stamen and the stigmatic lip, and that's where the hybridizing takes place. Those are the sex organs of the iris, and below the, I don't know if you can see my arrow.
Yes.
Right in here, below there is where the iris, then the basically the seed pod grows from that. And then when the flower itself dies off, the seed pod would be there and growing. And you'll often find, if you're growing irises, you may find that you've got what looks like a seed pod on your irises, and sometimes there is seeds there that bees have been busy, but a lot of time it's a sterile pod because it's self-pollinated and it won't produce any seeds. If I were to take the stamen and rub it along the stigmatic lip there and do it on all three sides of that iris, then I would have a pretty good chance of growing some. And as a matter of fact, I've got 4 large cans that I've got probably 40 seedlings right now that I need to transplant. And each one of those, like your children, each child looks a little bit different because the 2 parents, different parts of the gene come together. And so I wanted to show you that. This iris on the left is one that I hybridized back in 2015, and it first bloomed last year. And so you start thinking, well, how did those colors come about? Where did that purple in the beard come from, and those lines in the falls? So I went back a generation, and because these were the parents of Bluebeard's ghost and snow peas, and you can see some of the lines in snow peas appear in the falls of sweetie pie, and the blue in Bluebeard's ghost sort of shows up in a little bit different color, but the color in sweetie pie, but still not quite exactly. So I wanted to go back another generation, and so this is the grandparents here, and let me see if I can. Island Sun and Experiment were the parents of Bluebeard's ghost, and Snow Tree and Green Tree were the parents of snow peas.
Oh my gosh.
So if you could go back another generation from that even, and it would give you some idea of where the final coloring comes into the iris that you've created. And so I've got over 40 seedlings that I'm now puzzled about and saying, okay, what did I actually produce? Because unfortunately, I didn't keep the best records on these seedlings, and I can't tell you what the parentage might be for these. So it's going to be a crapshoot here.
I thought that irises were tubers. How do you get seedlings when you're rubbing them and making them do their thing?
Well, irises are actually rhizomaceous. There are bulb types of iris, but they're a completely different family, and some of those are beardless. But the bearded irises come from a rhizome, and so you can, once you have a rhizome, then that will always produce that iris here. Every time I plant a division of sweetie pie, it will always look like this. But if I take and hybridize this and put pollen from another flower on to the stigmatic lip of sweetie pie, then I'm going to get a whole new group of irises, and they'll have characteristics of all these parents going back. Does that make sense?
Remarkable.
Okay.
Mhm.
So one of the questions I often get about, well, where and how should I plant irises? And so I wanted to just give you some basic tips here. Iris is pretty tolerant of most soils, even soils around the lake here. They'll do pretty good. This area here where my irises are down at the lake, that was a gravel driveway when I started. I didn't realize it because it was covered over with grass, but I was so determined because it was the only sunny area in my yard that I had to put it right there. So this is sort of my obsession coming through. But I had to dig down about 12 inches of gravel to put this one bed in over here. The rest of this is all fill dirt here before the lake was actually even formed. But in any case, they need about 6 to 8 hours of sun every day. And best is in morning sun is better than afternoon sun. It's a little too hot in the afternoon, but as long as they get about 8 hours of sunlight, they'll be okay. And you know, I've done a little bit of treating of this soil after I dug out the gravel, but it doesn't require a lot. And the one thing that's that is often a mistake made is to bury the irises under mulch, to mulch them right up there and make the bed look real nice. And yes, that does cut down on the weeds, but it also smothers the iris and leads to root rot. So you don't want to cover over the iris rhizome itself. And I'll talk a little bit about where and how you plant it. You don't need to water it a lot. They're pretty good once they're established. I didn't do any watering this last year, and this is what it looks like. Of course, it actually looks older. This is a week 2 old, 2 weeks older, and so a lot of these are blooming now. Fertilizing time for most irises, it's early spring, about the time that March Madness comes along. That's sort of your external signal of when you need to get out in the garden. And then the thing to keep in mind, though, is that irises do not need a lot of nitrogen. So you can find at Southern States, or I think even at Lowe's or Home Depot, even maybe over here at Moneta Farm Supply, you can get a low nitrogen fertilizer, the 5-10-10 or the 6-12-12. Either one of those will work well for fertilizing. And so you put just like a tablespoon around each clump of irises. If they're reblooming irises, then you probably in later summer or later after this bloom cycle is over, fertilize those irises again. And then that'll help encourage the bloom in the springtime. Any questions? One thing there at the end, the transplant in August and September. You want to dig up the irises after they've bloomed. So you want to wait until after all the blooming is done and they've had a chance to kind of rest. But then you want to get them, if you're going to transplant them or plant new, you want to get them in the ground in August, September. And here in around the lake, Southern Virginia, that can stretch into October. The key is to get them in the ground and get the roots started before the first frost, so that they have an established growth there. Now would be a good time to prepare the ground that you're going to put your irises in. Kimberly and I have been logging all the ones that are blooming that I need to divide. And there's a lot of these irises in here that I'm going to have to thin out because they're already too thick. And we're going to have an opportunity through Bethlehem United Methodist Women to have a sale for irises, but this will be in August. Probably August, September, somewhere around there. I hope earlier so that you have time to get them planted if you're interested in them. So planting irises. I have another bed of irises that you couldn't see in the previous picture, and this is in another location over at White House that a friend of mine was willing to give me a nice sunny location. And the irises on the right were planted 2 years ago, and they just have blown up. I have to thin this first row to the right of the new plantings. These new plantings I put in August this past year. Again, you need a sunny, well-drained location, but you can see this soil is nothing spectacular. But you need to plant them probably about 12 to 18 inches apart and orient the heel. The heel is the back side of the iris here. So here's your iris. all these little knobs on the side are the new growths, the new divisions that are coming out. There will be nothing coming, no flower coming out of here, out of the back end, but all these on the side will send up new growth and new bloom stalks. So all these that I've planted here, they look nice, but the flowers are going to come out of all these new divisions that are coming here. So the toe, you plant the iris so that the top of the rhizome is just at ground level, and the roots are spread out down into the soil. So what I did is I created a hole with a mound, spread the roots out around that mound, and orient. There's two ways of thought. One is to orient the rhizome so that the sun is shining on it. But you want to, where you want the expansion to go, it's going to go toward the back end, the heel. This is where new growth is going to start coming out. It won't come out the front this way. It'll go out the back and along the sides here. So I've these over here, this new growth here, they just went poof. they're all the same. This whole row, I couldn't bear to throw them away when I divided before, and so I just planted them all in a row, and these are all dark purple right here. So almost burgundy, I guess. But these are all new ones here, and they're starting to put up bloom stalks now. And so normally the division, you would dig up that clump every 3 to 4 years and divide it and find friends that you want to give your divisions away to so that somebody else can enjoy the irises. But this is the time in zone 7A that August through October to plant the irises. Well, this is a why don't my irises bloom? Well, part of the reason might be that it's too crowded, which means it needs to be divided, and the old rhizome needs to be cut away, or the soil has been depleted of nutrients and you need to fertilize with that low nitrogen fertilizer. Or there's not enough sun, because when you planted them, the trees weren't as big as they are today. And so now the soil is, or the trees are shading over the irises. Or we planted them too deep, buried the rhizome, and so it's not getting enough sunlight on the rhizome itself. And then you just planted them. So, you know, if you got a bloom in the first year, that's sometimes is a bonus. And this last reason is not anything that, I'm sorry that this is not coming out the way I wanted it to. So we haven't had a problem with late frost. Diseases. You see this sometimes, and a lot of this disease that I'm going to talk about, the fungal leaf spot and the bacterial, are all because of either crowding or cleanup. If you just keep your iris bed cleaned up, take away all the dead leaves and keep that nice and clean, most of this problem goes away. You don't really end up with this kind of a problem. I noticed that I had quite a bit of this leaf spot on that one row over in here. It grew in so thick, and there's not enough air flowing through there now, and it just needs to be thinned out and divided. There we go. So the solution for this leaf spot is to just trim away the damaged leaves, avoid overhead watering, and clear away the dead leaves. And when I say clear away the dead leaves, don't put it in your mulch pile. Take it away, destroy it. Don't leave it near your irises because it will just cause problems later. Bacterial leaf blight, similar problem. Again, it's because of overwatering or too crowded, and you'll get this kind of a problem. And the easiest solution, it's not going to kill the plant, but it's kind of ugly, and so you want to make it look pretty, you just trim them up. And typically when you trim the iris, you trim it in a fan shape like that, because that's the way it normally grows from that center leaf out. That makes sense? All right. So then crown rot or southern blight. One way to treat this is with a bleach solution and remove the mulch from around the rhizome. This is what happens if the mulch gets piled up too high over the iris itself, and it causes this crown rot around the base of the iris. And this also leads into other kinds of problems like iris borer and soft rot. And this looks awful on the left, and it smells bad, but it's not completely lost. So what I've had that happen to me, and what I did is I took an old spoon and I scraped away the rotted part until I came to where it was solid and healthy rhizome, and then I treated that with a like a Clorox, or not Clorox, I'm sorry, with like Comet or Ajax, and just that powder. This is not Master Gardener official, this is Doug Coffey unofficial advice, but that powder will dry out the rhizome, keep the bacteria from spreading, and you can save that iris. And that's happened for me. So that cleaning powder, but don't forget to throw away all that rotted mush. Don't let it pile up in a mulch pile or something like that. So then there's one other, oh, this is terrible. My best slide.
It's okay.
When I first planted that row of irises down there that I dug out of a 12-inch deep gravel driveway, I covered over the new planted irises with pine straw, which is better than leaf mulch. It's better than just leaving leaves piled up because it allows air to flow through. But what it did for me was provide a convenient path for voles to run up and down and chew up all of my rhizomes. And I lost about 25, 30 in a row from these little buggers. And what I ended up doing to protect myself from that is I put in a gravel worked it into the soil and all around the edge of the flower bed. And the little guys don't want to get their nose cut, so they don't get in there. Deer, I have never had a problem with deer. I have a fellow master gardener who claims that she's had deer destroy her irises, and they don't seem to bother. It's kind of like daffodils. They don't pay much attention. There's enough other good stuff out there like azaleas and hostas and things like that I have never really had a problem at all with deer, and I would think where I live that it would be the perfect place for them.
I had even heard that they were more of a deer repellent.
I haven't seen it one way or the other. It's too bad you can't see this one picture because this.
It won't load, huh?
Anyway, what I did discover though is that Canada geese are quite attracted to the foliage. But fortunately, they do it in the fall or early spring in the time that I need to be cleaning up my iris beds. So they save me a lot of work by cleaning up all the leaves. But they're there, and I, every once in a while I have to get out there and make sure they stay away, especially during the bloom time. Now, Layla, I'm sorry you can't see this picture, but Layla is my lab. And that's Canis familiaris for dog. Anyway, Layla is not a big threat, but when she gets excited and she goes running back and forth through my garden, she can knock over bloom stalks and she can cause great havoc.
Aw.
So she's gotten better about that because she doesn't know I can scream that loud when I go over to keep her away. Now, the iris borer there, I wanted to show you a picture of what it looks like and what it's doing to the iris when it gets in there. A lot of this comes about because of not keeping the iris bed clean and getting rid of all because what happens in the fall is that the moth that creates this borer lays its eggs on the dead leaves of your irises. So if you don't clean them away in the fall, then those eggs hatch and the larvae then start going down the leaf stalk and burrow down into the rhizome there. And they just burrow out the whole inside of the iris, and all you're left with is the bloom stalk itself. And you wonder what happened here. Well, again, this is mostly caused because of poor cleaning, poor maintenance of the iris bed. And it can be, you can treat that if you find it. It's possible you can treat it in the spring with a solution of merit, I think is the recommended pesticide to use on this. But I find that if you just keep your iris bed clean and take away all of the dead leaves and everything, that you don't have this problem. And that's, I think, the best way to solve this. So this is what my iris bed looks like today. This is another area, not the ones that in that first picture, but I have 3 areas that I have irises growing, and this is just a terrace. Irises, like I said, will grow in just about any soil condition. They like a slope because they don't want wet feet. They don't want to have their roots and rhizomes sitting in wet ground, moist ground. On a slope is a perfect kind of environment for them. So that's all I had for you right now, but I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Doug. I tell you, I've taken a few notes here myself, is that I think I've got my irises planted on the wrong side of the house. They need more sun than where I have them. And I always called them tubers, but I know that I was using the wrong name. So rhizome. And yours, when you showed pictures of them planted, I don't see what I would call tubers. I don't see the rhizome like little rooty things. And so I don't know how deep you're saying to not plant them too deep and not to cover them with a bunch of mulch, but how deep do we plant them? Because I can see mine every year. Are they still coming up? But that I can see the little whites of their eyes.
Well, in this picture here, you could cover over all but this part right here, right in here.
Yeah.
that's sort of the top of the rhizome is at the surface. Now it's not going to harm them if you have like a ½ inch of soil or so on top of it. That's okay. There's been a lot of debate about that, but I think that right here is what we're going to probably do is just if you plant them so that just the top edge of the iris rhizome is on the surface and everything else, then it's locked. It's going to be held in place by the roots, and you can see the roots spread out, and they'll get pretty long. So.
Okay, and then we had another question here, and I've unmuted everybody now, so that's why we're starting to hear bird noises and such. But someone wanted to know about, if you'll tell us where to get irises. You had already said you're going to be selling some in August through the church, maybe. I somehow don't have my chat box, but Sherry had a question. What was that, Sherry? About that?
Well, if the question is where can you get irises, probably the last place I would go is Brex or one of the catalogs like that. There are a lot of iris hybridizers that are selling irises. They, like all of us, are having a challenge right now with quarantine and COVID-19 concerns, but they're still growing irises. That isn't stopping. So there are a number of hybridizers that do, they send out catalogs. Shriners is probably the biggest well-known catalog business, and Shriner, SCHREINER. You can go online and look at their website. Cooley's Midwest, or no, Mid-America Garden is another one. Mid-America Garden.
Okay, I'm jotting these down. And looks like Diane has walked out to her iris.
Yes,
garden.
I have. And you know, Doug, I don't see as many blooms as what you have. Usually by this time, everybody is in bloom. Is it because of the cold weather?
No, I don't know. I mean, it hasn't been that cold. I've got blooms that came out yesterday, and I thought it could be. I don't know. That looks kind of a shady area. I can't see your screen.
Yeah, it's not really. It gets full sun most of the time. Right now, the sun is right in a position to, have the other trees block it. But gosh, usually by this time, everybody is blooming.
Yeah. Well, it's still early. Still early in the season. I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
Are you seeing any bloom stalks at all, or are you just?
Oh yes.
Okay.
I've got one great big one, and I did do some aggressive dividing last year, but they still seem so close together.
Yeah, that's the one thing about iris is that they told me every 3 to 5 years, and I'm this row on this one slide here, I planted
Yeah.
that 3 years ago, and it
Yeah.
definitely needs to be divided already.
And when
Oh
you
yeah.
divide, do you cut them? Do you just cut them, or is there? Can you kill them by just cutting them with a shovel?
I use a spade fork, fork spade, yeah, and dig up the whole clump, and then you can just break the clump apart and cut out all the dead rhizome until you get back to a really healthy one, and really just throw away the stuff that's kind of puny, only maybe has 2 leaves growing or only 1 leaf growing on it. I wouldn't waste your time with that. Look for the one that's got a good, healthy set of roots coming out of it. Like the one here, this is what I would keep. You know, it's got good, healthy roots. It's got divisions on it. And the rest of that clump, probably best to just throw it away unless you're obsessive like I am, and then you would try to keep it, you know. But then what do? You filled up your space with a whole bunch of irises that took more work than.
I can tell that you do have a slight problem with your obsession.
Yeah, sort of.
I'm obsessed too, Doug.
Well, these right here, you might not be able to tell in this picture, but these in the foreground right here came from one of those two names I mentioned, Shriners and Mid-America Gardens.
Yeah.
And one of the things that if for an order of like $50, they throw in a bonus iris. So I've got 3 2019 introductions in here.
Yeah.
The ones in the far back here, you can't really tell, but those are all historic irises. And I bought what have I got going on here? Oh.
Those are beautiful.
Oh, this is what I was talking about when I was crowded.
Yeah. Mine are too crowded.
Oh, that's what mine looks like. Yeah.
So when you just dig that whole clump up,
Okay.
and
Not now, not this time of year, but
no, definitely not now, because they're getting ready to put up bloom stalks. Do this in August.
Okay.
You could do it in July, but August is a good time to do this, and then you can break off this. So this right here is probably a good one. This is a good one. That's a good one here, but all this stuff right in here is all just dead.
Yeah.
It's just taking up space, and it won't. It's keeping it from putting up bloom.
All right. Thank you. That's my problem.
So.
Are there other questions anyone wants to ask of Doug?
There's Layla.
Oh, she finally loaded.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
When you do your cleanup, when the irises are all finished, how do you clean up? Do you, I mean, I just kind of like mow over the bed with my blade on as high as it'll go and then clean it all up. But is that a no-no? Should you just wait till they turn brown from frost, or what is the best way to do the cleanup at the end of the season?
Well, that's a good question, because it raises a couple of points that I'd like to make. One, you can mow it down, but then what happens to what you just mowed away?
It starts growing back immediately.
No, but I mean that debris that you blew away with a mower.
Oh yeah, I have to clean that up with a rake and dispose of it.
So it is not going to kill the irises to have mowed over them. As a matter of fact, in my mother's garden, that was done a couple of times accidentally, and they still came up. But often after the bloom season is over, the thing to do is to go around and snap off the bloom stalks. And it's a pretty simple thing to do, is just to take it right at the bottom of the bloom stalk, and with a quick snap, you can break it off right at the rhizome. If it doesn't, then just use a knife and cut it off right at the bloom stalk. But that's part of the debris that you need to take away.
Okay.
The leaf fan itself, there's a lot of thought that you need to trim them all up and take away all the, I don't quite follow that. I didn't do any trimming up this year except for the dead stuff. I took all the dead stuff away, and where there was bacterial leaf spot or anything like that, I trimmed that up. But I left most of it just growing all through the winter. and it
Mhm.
stayed green, and it's fine.
Okay,
It's
that's
actually
great.
getting energy and nutrients from the sun through those leaves. So when you cut it back, you're sort of stunting its growth for the time being. So
I see.
I didn't really do any trimming up at all. But if you're going to trim it up, then trim it up, say 6 to 8 inches above the rhizome in kind of a V shape like that.
Okay,
And that's usually the best way to handle that.
thank you.
Doug, is there a way that people can contact you if they wanted to ask you more questions, perhaps an email or, I know you said you're a master gardener.
Yeah, sure. I'll give you my email address.
And let me see if I can find that chat box again and I could type it in there. Okay.
It's Doug.Coffey, Coffey, 00 at gmail.com. And I welcome anybody who wants to come and look at my irises. We'll make sure that there's proper social distancing and everything, so that you can kind of look at what I've got growing right now.
Oh, shit, I didn't get it.
And then also, as I mentioned earlier, my wife and she's going to help me put together a catalog of the irises that I have been growing. And the ones that I'm going to divide. And then you can look at the picture. It'll give you the name of the iris. Some people like to know what the names of irises are. So,
Well,
Doug, are you planning to sell any of your Beverly Sills rhizomes?
well, as a matter of fact, yes.
Oh, good.
I don't know, what the heck is that? I've got a big red scratch across this thing.
I love the Beverly Sills.
Yeah, there's several offspring of Beverly Sills that have a similar pink,
Yeah.
but Beverly Sills is one that I've got growing. And as a matter of fact, I was out there yesterday, and there's several bloom stalks coming up. So I expect that in the next few days it'll be blooming.
Oh, good.
And this Mart down here in the lower right corner,
Oh, that's wonderful.
I was really intrigued with that one, and that's a new one that I just got this past year. And so it looks like it's going to be putting up a bloom stalk for the first time here in the next couple of weeks.
Those are so beautiful. Go ahead, Doug.
I was just going to say that we're just now entering the bloom season for tall bearded. All the smaller ones that bloom early, like the standard dwarf bearded, the intermediate bearded, and so forth, they're blooming now. But the tall bearded are just coming in, and so I would say in another week or two we'll be at peak bloom, and depending upon how the weather goes here, but it may go a lot faster next week probably.
We have several kudos here in the chat room. I know you haven't had a chance to look, but people saying that this was very informative and it's making them motivated to go split up some of their family irises and transplant them this fall. And so Catherine's showing us.
Well,
Yeah,
My 1-year-old is loving looking at all the beautiful flowers.
well, if there's any questions when you get ready to divide, by all means, give me a call or email me, and we can talk you through it. Or if we're done with quarantining, I can even come over and
Could you
demonstrate.
repeat your email?
Yeah,
it's in the chat box. I put it there. It's doug.coffey00@gmail.com. And it's also in the chat box. And we're recording this. It will be on the Smith Mountain Lake virtual community. If you wanted to share this presentation with others, probably won't be up for a week or so. Right, Heather? she's maybe muted herself, but she's the one that'll edit it together and post it, but it won't be today. She's got other jobs. But I don't want to hold Doug up for too long, but I do want to applaud you and thank you so much for being here with us. This was great.
Thank you.
Well,
Thank you, Doug. Learned a lot.
I'm glad I got to share some of this with you because I had a much longer presentation that I was going to give to the Grow the Good Life, and it was sort of sitting there unused, and I thought, oh, maybe next year.
Yeah, well, you can do it again next year for us in person, but we used almost an hour anyway. People have lots of questions, and irises to me are just so interesting. So thank you, everybody that joined. At the height, it looked like we had maybe 15 participants, and so that's a great number for a Zoom meeting. And
Yeah.
just want to tell everybody to keep using your head about your social distancing and be safe, and hopefully we'll see each other in person soon.
Hopefully, inshallah. I will write this up for the Blue Ridge Digest.
Part of the gardening outreach. Thank you.
Karen,
Yeah.
the rest of the others are in this Zoom meeting. Do you want to share with them about the tool grant?
Oh,
Tool grant?
sure. Just the others of you that are here from the gardening club. I applied for the Ames tool grant. You can apply for, I think, $250 worth of tools, and I applied for those for our preschool, and we got the grant, and they will be mailing the tools, and once school's back in, the children will be able to use them.
Well, this is
Wonderful.
this is a fantastic thing, since this is a nationwide grant that's and not that many are awarded. So applause to you.
Well, I was glad to do it. It was another opportunity that we had to help our preschoolers with their gardening program. All right, people are signing off, so I'll sign off. I'll end the meeting, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Of course, thanks for setting this up, Karen.